Video games have come a long way over the years, graphically at least. I grew up in a generation that is accustomed to games with relatively high graphical fidelity. Because of this, when I do decide to go back and play video games from older generations, they can sometimes creep me out. There's something about older games that's a little unsettling at times. Well, it's more than just unsettling. It's a feeling that's hard to describe, almost liminal. But we'll get into it. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Evernight Writer, and tonight we're going to be discussing why video game worlds can sometimes feel a little unsettling. If you do enjoy this video, a subscription helps immensely. In recent years, you've likely seen images like this one, or this one. They're often accompanied by very slow atmospheric music. These are so-called liminal spaces. The Oxford Dictionary defines the word liminal as characterized by being on a boundary or threshold, especially by being transitional or intermediate between two states. You can kind of see this in these images. They're empty. You'll often see empty malls devoid of the usual consumerist traps. No ads, no signs, and most importantly, no people. You'll also often see empty pools, places that are usually semi-crowded, now empty or abandoned. But it is important to recognize that liminal spaces aren't ruins. They're empty and devoid of people, but it's more so seeing a place where you'd expect people to be with no one there. Imagine staying after school and walking through an empty hallway. These places aren't run down or dirty, at least not in the way a crumbling ruin would be. A good way to think about it is, it's as if the location is being cleaned out. Like it was previously inhabited, but now it's empty. That point in time where everything has been removed, but nothing new has yet been added. The transitional period. Of course, that's liminal in the context of these images. The word can have other connotations depending on the context in which it's being discussed. This is the more established and widely accepted explanation of what a liminal space is. I'll go over what I think it means to me later on. So what does this have to do with video games? Well, I believe that some video games have the capacity to invoke that same feeling of liminality that can sometimes feel unsettling. My main inspiration for this project was a recent playthrough of one of my favorite games of all time, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. It's the mission Mad Dog's Rhymes. We had to sneak through the rapper's Hollywood mansion to steal his music book containing his lyrics. I've done this mission many times. San Andreas is one of those games where I'll do a few playthroughs every 3 years or so. Yet, whilst going through the mansion on my most recent playthrough, it was eerie. Something about Mad Dog's mansion made me feel really odd, the same way I'd feel when I looked at images like this. The question is, why? Well, earlier I mentioned that video games have come a long way graphically. I grew up in a time when graphical standards are far removed from games as old as San Andreas. The ultimate goal for any game that chooses to go down the route of realism is to present the world as accurately as possible. When looking at a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, the game goes to extreme lengths to convince you that what you're seeing is reality. In some cases, it's the small things like the accumulating snow on Arthur's jacket or foliage reacting to his presence. But a big part of the illusion of reality is ensuring that you see what you'd expect to. The 1899 frontier was a very different place relative to now. The game does a phenomenal job representing old America, flora and fauna. Their points for RDR2 is indistinguishable from real life. The wonders of modern technology. The thing is, back in the days of San Andreas, graphical technology was a bit more primitive, relative to today at least. It's clear that Rockstar was attempting to represent their fictional take on California as realistically as they could have, but were ultimately limited by the technology of the time. A part of what makes this place feel liminal is that it's empty. You're not seeing things you'd expect to see. Mad Dog's mansion is empty. It feels like he just moved in, or maybe he's just really into minimalism or something. I mean, the place isn't completely empty. There is a gym and a living room area, but even then, those places invoke that same feeling of liminality. And then there's the pool. I talked about how images of empty pools can feel weird, and yeah, this one gives that same feeling, maybe not to the same extent, but still. All of that combined with the low-res textures and flat lighting made the mansion feel unsettling, to me at least. Another large contributor to this is the lack of any background music. These online liminal spaces are often accompanied by equally empty and atmospheric music. In video games, a great way to set a tone of a quest or mission is through music. I discussed this more broadly in my previous video about video game music. But in the case of San Andreas, there was no music. A matter of fact, the only place in the game where you really hear music is through radios and some cutscenes. Whilst going through the mansion, the only thing you'd hear is footsteps and a repetitive sounding game system. The mansion was large and spacious, yet there was virtually no reverb. This creates a level of disconnect with the environment you're in, especially coming from outside where there's plenty of ambience. It's important to note that liminality is sort of subjective. What makes something feel liminal to me might not invoke the same feeling from you. A part of what makes any setting liminal, in my case, is that weird feeling when you're somewhere you're not supposed to be, seeing something you're not supposed to see. While researching for this video, I realized that I had that same weird feeling when I went out of bounds of any video game map. It doesn't really have those obvious elements you'd often see in a liminal setting, but it's the fact that you're not supposed to be there. It's the same thing with the empty malls. You're not supposed to be there, or the pool before it opens or after it closed, or the black rooms, for instance, or Mad Dog's mansion. It wasn't just Mad Dog's mansion. There are many locations throughout San Andreas and many other older titles that invoke that liminal experience. Another location that has consistently felt unsettling is the San Andreas woodlands, the countryside. On paper, it shouldn't be, as all the reasons I stated for why Mad Dog's mansion felt so weird are absent here. The woodlands aren't empty, there's plenty of flora in the form of foliage on the ground, which is something you would expect to see. And it makes sense that it's really quiet as you're in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. Even then, there is ambience. The reason why these woodlands feel weird to me are actually the trees. Pine trees in San Andreas feel really large, unsettlingly so. I mean, they do get this large in real life, but as someone who's never really been in the woods, it still feels weird. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a feeling of liminality, at least not in the way Mad Dog's mansion felt. It's a feeling of scale, the feeling of being small relative to the world around you. That's another one of the failings of the remastered GTA trilogy. Back in the day, climbing Mount Chiliad really made you feel a sense of verticality in the world's design. Now it's just a rock in the background because of the higher draw distance. There are some more modern games that use a sense of scale to have different effects on the player's experience and/or perception of their world. For instance, From Software often uses scale to invoke a sense of awe through their games. I remember seeing the Divine Bridge when I first stepped into Elden Ring's Limgrave, underestimating how large it would actually be, until eventually getting closer to it and realizing the terrifying scale. I had a similar experience with the Erdtree, where I genuinely thought it was just a backdrop, until I eventually got there, realizing that it's really just that big. All that being said, I'd never really described FromSoft's use of scale to be unsettling or liminal. It's more so to present a sense of awe and magnificence to the locations you're visiting, especially in the case of Elden Ring. That's not to suggest that these games won't make you feel uncomfortable, they definitely do, but unsettling isn't really how I describe anything FromSoft makes. But there is a game that uses scale and environmental design to an incredible degree. A game that simultaneously invokes that feeling of unsettling scale with its environments, while also invoking that similar sense of awe you'd feel in a FromSoft title. It's an indie game called Bleak Faith Forsaken. Now, I'm not going to speak on how the game plays, but visually, it's one of the most interesting video game worlds I've ever seen. The idea of a Souls game in a more sci-fi setting is something I've always thought would be interesting, and I'm surprised it took this long to see one. Bleak Faith is set in a place called the Omnistructure, in what seems to be a post-apocalyptic future where the world is dominated by robots? I don't even know, I'm really not too deep into the lore, but what I do know is that the world looks really unique. The combination of FromSoft awe through scale with a dark apocalyptic aesthetic creates a vastly unsettling atmosphere. There's a heavy feel of brutalism in how the world looks. Really large concrete-looking structures, large gray minimalist-looking buildings. You feel small and insignificant in the face of the monolithic environments. though just backdrops for the most part, they do a really good job of invoking that unsettling feeling of scale. Probably doesn't help that I was playing the game at 2 AM in a dark room. It's really immersive, but you do get that weird feeling of being glad that it's just a game and you're not actually there. When talking about scale, something that always comes to mind, at least for me, is space. If there's one thing that'll make you feel insignificant, it's the vast void of space, a scale so large you can barely comprehend it. The scale of space is unsettling to most, but can be downright terrifying to some. Astrophobia is defined as the severe and often irrational fear of stars and space. Now, I wouldn't say I personally have astrophobia, but there has been some moments where an experience went beyond discomfort. When talking about video games though, the game that made me feel the most dread isn't even really a video game at all. I mean, it has a listing on Steam, but still. Space Engine. It's a digital planetarium of sorts. It allows you to explore a really large representation of our universe. It has some real-world places, but for the gaps in our own knowledge, it randomly generates something. Whilst in this game, you can look up at any star in the sky and go there. To my knowledge, this is the only software that really allows you to do something like this. Every single star in every single galaxy. There's so many of them that it can be overwhelming, but where it gets really unsettling is when you go beyond just stars and explore other cosmic phenomena. Space Engine has it all. Neutron stars, nebulae, and what's probably the most terrifying, quasars in all their horrific majesty. First time a video game has ever made me so scared I actually turned the lights on was when I flew into a black hole. Just seeing the universe fade away like that. And I'd say that feeling of fear was pretty irrational. What, was the black hole hiding in the dark corner of my eye or something? But you could argue that I am cheating with Space Engine as it's not really a video game. There are quite a few space exploration games out there, but not a lot of them can invoke that same unsettling feeling that Space Engine does. When talking about space exploration, the first game that likely comes to mind is No Man's Sky. And I mean, it's a decent game, but at no point while playing it have I ever really felt unsettled. The game leans a lot closer to the fantasy side of space fantasy. A game that I would like to talk about though is Star Citizen. The game is more space sim than space fantasy, and I think the game itself deserves a deeper discussion at a later date, as I do have some major issues with how the game has been handled by the devs. But for now, something Star Citizen excels at is scale. The planets in this game aren't the small No Man's Sky moon planets that you can go from surface to space more or less instantly, but celestial bodies that feel truly planetary. Now, these planets aren't actually Earth-size. From what I hear, it's on a 1 to 10 scale with our actual universe. But that still leaves them so large that you could land on a planet and be hundreds of kilometers away from any other settlement. That feeling of being in the middle of nowhere with nothing at all for hundreds of miles is something Star Citizen excels at. It's an unsettling sense of beauty. Just nothing at all for as far as the eyes can see. Seeing the true scale of these celestial bodies from orbit, and unlike Space Engine, you can actually see your character floating above it. It's beautiful, yet terrifying. Moving about in the void of space, looking down below your feet and knowing that there's literally nothing forever. It's unsettling. Video games can be unsettling, whether through liminality due to low graphical fidelity or a vast scale that makes you feel small and insignificant. Video games as a medium has the capacity to make you feel and experience things no other form of art ever could. Maybe none of what I presented in this video made you feel the way it made me. Maybe something else makes you feel that way. Or maybe it's nothing at all. That's the beauty of art. We can all perceive it differently and leave with completely different interpretations of the same thing. Thanks for watching.